Hello and welcome to a very important panel discussion hosted by the Geostrata. The Indo-Pacific is what the 21st century geopolitics is hinged upon, where shifts in global power contestations over maritime security and transition toward sustainable and resilient economies are rapidly transforming the strategic landscape. Against this backdrop, the Quad has become an increasingly vital platform for fostering a rules-based order, about which Mr. Carafano here had some very interesting insights to share during the NATO-India Youth Conference conducted by the Geostrata in Delhi earlier this year. In the midst of the rise of multipolarity, recalibration of supply chains, critical mineral dependencies, and intensifying climate vulnerabilities, this panel congregates academics and policymakers from the Quad nations to underscore strategic cooperation in maritime domain awareness, critical mineral security, climate change mitigation, and regional supply chain resilience. And to unpack some of the most pressing common issues, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. John Coyne, Director, National Security Program, ASPI, Mr. James Bowen, Climate Analytics, REMAP and Australia-India Institute, and Mr. James J. Carafano, E.W. Richardson Fellow, Heritage Foundation. Now that we are through the intros, how have you folks been?
I've been good, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for organizing.
It's fantastic to be able to join you guys.
Right, so now we all have joined from different time zones and interestingly from one of the Quad partners to discuss issues common to Quad nations. And to, of course, now, since we are talking about Indo-Pacific and Quad's role in it, let's start with opening remarks from our guests and we'll move forward in a circle, starting with Dr. Coyne, followed by Mr. Bowen, and then Mr. Carafano.
Look, thank you very much. And I think I'll keep my comments very, very brief, and I'll keep them to two areas. The first one is, I guess, the why, and the second one is more granular around critical minerals and secure supply chains. Look, the Quad has had two lives. There can be no doubt about that. But if there's any doubt about its significance, it's really, if we look at the most recent reiteration of the Quad, is how Beijing responds to it and its concerns about it. The facts of the matter are that minilateralism is incredibly important in terms of maintaining the current rules-based order. And also minilateralism, which brings me on to my second point, is really one of the key ways in which we will create secure sovereign supply chains. Now, sovereignty is such a misunderstood word, especially when it comes to economic security. In the most part, many people think of it as an insular version. And certainly we've seen that play out to some extent, both with China and the US. But the truth of the matter is that markets, as we've become used to over the last 3 decades, especially in the critical mineral space, have become incredibly distorted to such an extent that realistically in the critical mineral space, if we want to have an alternative and resilient options for critical minerals other than those presented by China, then there is going to need to be some intervention in markets. The problem itself, especially when we look at certain critical minerals, for instance, rare earth elements, is clearly too big for one country to address on their own. And we've seen this play out. The US's Inflation Reduction Act and a number of other policy measures, including measures here in Australia. So I strongly believe that a minilateral effort by the Quad in terms of critical minerals has the opportunity to really bring about these alternative supply chains. And I want to caveat all of that is that we're talking here about alternative supply chains that are competitive, highly ESG compliant, and we're not talking about trade bifurcation. So we're not talking about replacing all of a Chinese supply chain. What we're talking about here is making sure that we have a resilient alternatives so that we're free from economic coercion, both as nations in their own rights, as the 4 Quad members are, but also as a collective and also in terms of the wider global economic environment. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I might just give some broad comments around the Quad as an introduction, and then we'll probably go into a bit more specifics in the question session. So, but thanks first for the invitation to speak today. It's a great event. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I've kind of worked at the intersection of foreign policy and climate and clean energy and critical minerals for a while. And, I think I've seen interest in the Quad's role in these areas wax and wane for quite a while. And I think if I'm honest, so a lot of my levels of interest or belief in the utility of the Quad have probably fluctuated a lot over that time as well. But that's not because I think that the Quad is a bad idea in aggregate. I think it's more that probably hasn't lived up to some of the potential that I think it has, and probably a lot of people think it has. Because I do think there has been, and often something approaching an ideal alignment of needs and interests within the Quad, including a lot of the areas we're discussing, but seizing on that has been elusive on those opportunities. So in terms of some of the framing around the conversation today, I do wonder a little bit about the ability of the Quad to function in that role of norm setting and standardization at a broad level, because I think essentially needs some sort of external agent to establish and enforce some sense of norms and standardization on the group itself, on the Quad itself, and how it operates. So, I think it's a particularly challenging time for cooperation in the Quad and between the Quad and external partners, including a lot of the areas we're talking about today, because we've really seen a bit of a backsliding around international cooperation. I think I need to be honest, around under the Trump administration in particular, which you can't shy away from in the US. I think if you probably asked me during the Biden era, I'd probably have a different perspective on the Quad's potential future role in a lot of the areas we're discussing today. I think there was a bit more commitment to cooperation and taking on some of those big challenges like climate change or hard security as well, hard traditional military security. And this issue of multipolarity in the Indo-Pacific as well. I don't know that we can still think about it as just a matter of kind of some states categorically rising or some states categorically declining. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around where everyone sits at this point in time, and some sorts of sense of impermanence to the status quo. There's not a categorical story about the rise of China anymore, or the decline of the US, or who else might kind of fill the void. So, and I don't want to say that the Quad was perfect in the Biden era by any means either. It wasn't perfectly aligned on a lot of issues. And that's down to a lot of countries having flaws the way they approached it, and there just being a general lack of cohesion amongst the partners on some of those issues that we're talking about today. But I think that there was, a sense of cooperation that was starting to develop under the Biden era, and it was promised essentially around some future progress, probably in things like critical minerals, in things like supply chains and clean energy and climate cooperation. But this is, I guess, this is the nature of democracy, political change, and the nature of impermanence around the political process as well. But I think that's kind of at a domestic level. That's why we have things like permanent and apolitical bureaucracies that are separated from the elected political leadership, and you can get that sort of sense of continuity in the policy space and policy development space. I think that's a bit of a reason why we see a lot of support for something like a permanent secretariat in the Quad, and more institutional heft for some sense of continuity, as well as planning, and as well as the ability to actually put in place what the Quad promises to do. So, starting off with a bit of pessimistic note, perhaps, but I kind of believe in that mantra of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So I think there's still a lot of hope for meaningful cooperation on a lot of these issues between different combinations of the Quad and perhaps with external partners. And ideally, what can happen now can grow and outlast some sort of current period of doubt and instability, and there'll be collective willingness to take on some of these big challenges in future, as I mentioned. So in terms of some of these issues around climate change or critical minerals or supply chains, I think we're all just generally talking about security in a broad sense. So whether traditional security or non-traditional security. So from my perspective, I really think there's a great ability and great utility in the Quad developing some sort of broad-based alignment on an idea of how these various types of traditional and non-securities interact in the current era, and to put some sort of plan in place based on that. So, looking at traditional military security alongside economic security, energy security, climate security, and so on. And I don't think there has to be tensions between those, but there does seem to be some sort of perception that there are, particularly around like climate and energy security. I think also, as John kind of touched on, there's a bit of pushback, I guess, against this economic security sort of mantra, and we might be turning against the benefits of free trade and turning against the benefits of globalization. I think we need to balance all these things together, but the Quad can be a great vehicle for balancing those things and, as I said, advancing this broad-based kind of comprehensive view of security. So I'll leave it there, and we'll touch on some more specifics, I think, in the questions. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I think they raised, John and James raised actually two perfect examples of the utility of the Quad, critical minerals and the energy conversation. The critical mineral side, that is a tailor-made issue for something like the Quad, which isn't bound by kind of a traditional bureaucracy. Here's an emerging strategic issue where all the four of the countries have common interests from both a producer perspective and a user perspective, broadly affecting markets in the region. And critical minerals are a particular challenge because you can get a mine and you can build a processor, but then if the Chinese just decide to drop commodity prices, then you can't compete with that. So there has to be a market and mechanism to sustain commodity prices, to break the back of the Chinese dominance in the way we kind of broke the back of OPEC. That might be through strategic stockpiling. If the Chinese want to dramatically drop the price, then everybody will go in, buy a bunch of stuff and stockpile it. They'll drive the price back up and it'll keep their industry competitive. So that's a perfect example of an area where the Quad, I think, could really shine. I also think the energy is also a good answer, and particularly because the Trump administration is obviously headed in a very different direction of policies from the Biden administration. The framework doesn't start with how are we going to achieve green transition, how are we going to decrease our dependency on fossil fuels. It starts from a very, very different place. But the good thing is the Quad is a place where countries can go and have honest conversations about that, and not bound by politics and the flavor of the day and everything else. So it's actually, even though it might be a controversial issue in the differences between the U.S. and maybe some other countries, it's actually the perfect place to talk that. So I think issues like that show why the Quad, I think, really has value to the Indo-Pacific community. Personally, I see the lack of process and formality in a secretariat more as a plus than a minus. I think what we've actually seen is creating these permanent institutions creates institutions that are less flexible, less innovative. In some places, we've seen enormous Chinese incursion of influence, like in certain United Nations activities, and they've become politically corrupt. And so the fact that the Quad is more informal, I do think makes it more flexible. And it's an opportunity to kind of develop institutional structures for the 21st century rather than for the 20th century. And just being honest, I would never see a Trump administration moving more towards a really formalized secretariat structure. It's just not them. So it's an interesting thing to watch, and we'll see how the Quad progresses. What I really wanted to talk about was it's impossible to have a Quad without all four countries. And lately we've seen, I think, a lot of unprecedented tension in the U.S.-India relationship. So I just wanted to talk about that for a second, because it is really important. Because if the U.S. and India start to strategically diverge as opposed to strategically converge, then the Quad's going to have no utility whatsoever. I'd like to say I'm generally optimistic, and I don't want to say that this is the fact that Indians are upset over some of the statements during the Kashmir crisis. Trade negotiations didn't go as well as I think folks had hoped. The tariffs are obviously a real issue. I don't want to say it's a good thing, but in a way, the U.S.-Indian bilateral relationship has kind of been taken for granted a bit by both sides. We've gone through Republican and Democratic administrations. Things have kind of moved forward, and they've moved at a kind of good pace, but kind of a languid pace. And I actually think the tension that we're seeing now is not a sign of divergence. It's the sign of kind of the natural friction, even in strong by partnerships. I mean, there is no country that's been a more consistent strategic partner in the United States and Australia, really going back to the 1940s. That's not to say every day between Australia and the United States has been fun. Even during the 1940s, we had a lot of differences. So we have differences in the transatlantic community all the time. So some of this is just normal as nations kind of settle out their national interests. And the fact that the U.S., it's kind of like a perfect marriage is not one where people never fight. Sometimes a perfect marriage is where the couples actually kind of fight and they work out their real differences, and actually that makes the thing stronger. And I think the India and the U.S. have to get used to that. So I think we're going to work through this. In particular, I think the tariffs are interesting. I got to be honest, I don't think there's any appetite in the United States for massive tariffs on India. I mean, that does not serve the bilateral partnership well. It doesn't serve the economic partnership well. In the end, it isn't good for the U.S. economy. But I suspect they're not around for long. In part, there might be some willingness there on the part of the United States because of a little frustration that the trade deal didn't move faster. I think the U.S. expectation was that Australia was going to be one of the first deals they signed off on, not one of the last. But the other thing, and this is just my supposition, I don't have any secret inside knowledge from the administration, and we can explain Indian oil imports from Russia. I can explain that from the Indian perspective and what it means from the Indian economy. But the fact that the United States was willing to really sanction India, a very close strategic partner over this, I think that what the U.S. is doing there is sending a really powerful message to the Russians that we're really serious about this. And I think it's not perhaps a coincidence that immediately after Trump actually pulled the trigger on that the Russians said, hey, wait, maybe we should talk about this. And maybe they got some feedback from the Indians on this. I don't know. But I don't think that that these level of tariffs are going to be around for long. And I can argue for both countries why this is maybe not a smart thing, or why from their perspective it might be a smart thing, but I think it's just a temporary phase. I actually think we're heading in the right direction. So I'm just going to flag one other issue and I'll be off, which is one of the things that I'm increasingly keeping an eye on here as an obstacle in the U.S.-India partnership is actually not the geostrategic issues and not the economic things. Defense cooperation's obviously moving ahead. And actually, if you talk to Indian officials like I have, they're pretty sanguine that this is all going to work out. But what I do keep an eye on is we have not a crisis level, but we have a rising level of anti-Hindu activity in the United States. We have an increased number of hate crimes, attacks on temples, and other things. And I could see the potential for people to try to weaponize attacks against Hindus in the United States, and then to whip up anti-American feelings in India against the United States because of activities in the United States, much in the way that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism was intentionally supported by a collection of foreign and domestic actors to try to stress the U.S.-Israeli partnership. I think that's just something that we have to keep an eye on. And part of the reason why I worry about it is when you talk to traditional groups that deal in this in the Hindu space and everything, they don't have any good ideas here. I mean, just being honest. They talk about, well, we need more education. We need more policing of the internet. We need more money for protecting, religious facilities like temples, for security grants. Well, let me tell you, these are all things that the U.S. did, and we still had this unprecedented dramatic rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think we really have to pay attention to networks that would potentially seek to weaponize anti-Hindu hate to stress the U.S. bilateral relationship. I could see China and Pakistan being behind something like this. And I think we've got to get ahead of the power curve and kind of take those network and support things off the table so that does not become a potential flashpoint. But generally, I think when you look across the bilateral partnerships, I'm actually pretty optimistic that individually the bilateral partnerships are pretty resilient, and that means I think that a good future for the Quad. So thanks.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for those opening remarks. I think we have set our agenda very well, and our experts have noted down some of the very important points that we are going to speak about later in this conversation. Now, starting off with Dr. Coyne. Now, in your recent work on the dark side of the critical minerals rush, you highlight the infiltration of organized crime and the risks of governance breakdown, right? Now, in light of this, what legal and enforcement-oriented governance frameworks could the Quad jointly, advance to ensure ethical and transparent supply chains, specifically for critical minerals?
Look, thank you very much for the question. I think I want to riff slightly off, and now I'm going to use that traditional Australian cheekiness and say the Jameses. But look, I guess one of the things, and James C, you hit on this, which is quite often as academics or commentators or policymakers, we have a tendency of seeing these things through a slightly jaundiced viewpoint, okay, or perfection. And I'm never one. I'm a practitioner and a person who has worked 25 years in the field of strategic intelligence in one way or another, and 10 years in the land of think tanks. And I'd say I generally don't like giving quotes. But the question here is one where Henry Kissinger sort of put it to us, which is, and I'll do him in an injustice by not doing it properly. You have to deal with the world you have, not the one you wish you had. Secondly, that in that long lead in is that and I'll give a personal point of view on this, which is that for some time in relation to the maritime environment, I have been really concerned about the potential for strategic miscalculation and operational misadventure between China and the US, or China and Australia, particularly in the South China Sea. And I quite often, for a while there, I was sort of quoting and going, words to the effect that, it's not like the Cold War, there's no rules of the road in the same way that we had with the Russians, etc. And what I'd forgotten was very much that the rules of the road that we had during the Cold War evolved over time, often as a result of very almost moments of strategic miscalculation and operational misadventure. And those rules evolved over time. And so I guess at heart, I'm a pragmatist with these things. So questions like these are absolute ones. They're great to be, you can answer them detracted or distracted from the real world. So you can sit there and say, well, you know what, of course, what we need to do is price in a green ESG, which I would like, a green ESG factor into the markets globally for critical minerals, especially rare earth elements. So the London Metal Exchange should do that. Well, look, we know the London Metal Exchange is not going to do that. It's made a declaration that's not going to do it. Unfortunately, OEMs, so manufacturers, are going to look to their clients. So take lithium. If I was to get 100 Australians, 100 Americans, 100 Japanese, 100 Indians and say, go buy me a lithium battery, how many of them would look where the lithium came from as part of their decision-making basis? I want them to, James B. I really do want them to. But at the moment, that's not the case. The differentiator is price. So the answer to this, is not, there's no simple and not, that's a very long-winded way to get to the answer. The answer here is that I can give you one where I go, this is what they ought to do. But that's simply, it's not a perfect world. And so I would say to you, this is where government intervention in the markets really does come into play. The answer here is multifaceted. So, what we need right now is the artisanal removal of rare earth elements from, for example, Myanmar, at a time when the relationship with Myanmar is so troubled. Okay, there we need to focus on rule of law and democracy and building institutions. Unfortunately, James, as you know, US aid has taken a heavy hit, so that's going to be a hard road ahead there. And many great programs in the Mekong sub-region have been closed as a result of that. So my answer on this is at the very start point is the issue needs to be raised. There needs to be a market response to it where consumers in the market are increasingly aware across our 4 markets that price isn't the only differentiator of quality. And I'm reminded here, you might say, well, that's very naive, John Coyne. I'm reminded here of a project I did a decade ago around illicit timber of all things. So at the time, around roughly 250 people had been killed on the border of Cambodia and Thailand over illicit timber. When you go to Europe now and you go to an IKEA store to buy wooden furniture, okay, on the furniture it says exactly where the wood came from, that it's fully renewable. So there's only one product that is of the standard, and that's the product. It's not a green price, it's not a grey price, it's not anything else. A product that is suitable for the market has full ESG credentials from where that wood came from. In a similar way, when you go to buy steak in parts of Japan now, you go to Tokyo, you go to a supermarket or a butcher's and you buy a steak. The steak on the back of the packaging tells you exactly where it comes from. And people value that because there's a component, when they look at it, they go, well, I want to have organic beef that comes from lean, green backgrounds and supply chains. So there's some market things, consumer things we need to do about this, and that is changing. So people like James B and their work is really starting to have that impact. There is, on the other side, there is no absolute answer to that. We need to be looking across our aid programs and other programs about bringing along countries where there is artisanal mining. And third, we need to build the alternative supply chains. Japan has done this and starting to do this. It was economically coerced 12 years ago over rare earth elements. It has invested patient long-term capital into developing an alternative supply of rare earth elements. It has withstood non-market pressures, so the disinformation campaigns, the flooding the market at very strategic times with forcing the price down and creating volatility, legal action against processing plants, and it is staying the course. So in many cases, this is going to require staying the course. And the final part, that's not a pipe dream of collaboration. Right now, we're seeing this from India. From an Australian perspective, the Indian bureaucracy is vast. It is very difficult to traverse. And yet what I'm seeing here is a range of non-government and government interaction here in Australia right now, talking around critical minerals, rare earths, clean supply chain. So that process is beginning. I think that we have to have that degree of realism that there's no perfect answer to it. And I'm sure James B has got something to say on that, because I know we've talked about it in the past. Thanks.
Right, sir. Now, I think that's a very important point that you raised regarding compliance and governance of critical mineral resources. But I think the competition is so great to, hoard these critical mineral resources that the market itself, gets ahead of its own curve and then just, takes anything from anywhere just to fulfill the demands of the industry, right? So I think that needs to go upstream, as you rightly said. Now, Mr. Bhavan, moving on from critical mineral supply chain governance and law enforcement compliance, I recall your piece on the US-Australia Clean Energy Transformation Compact, right, which highlighted the need for mutual benefits in green industrial policy. Now, how do you envision a similar agreement under the Quad to, accelerate battery and solar manufacturing while balancing national competitiveness and shared infrastructure investment as well?
Thank you. So maybe I'll jump into responding to some of John's comments later as well, because I do have some thoughts about this side of things. But just on that particular question, so I'd state straight up that I think that assuring that responses to climate change or to any major challenge can create mutual opportunity if there is opportunity, so there's an economic opportunity, obviously, in the response to climate change through the development of clean industries, through green exports, through green trade, through green development, that there is some sort of mutual sharing of benefits there is incredibly important because it actually helps the transition as well. So when the Inflation Reduction Act kind of first came out in the US, there was a lot of fear, I think, in Australia in particular. There's a lot of companies who were concerned about capital being sucked into the US market essentially. That it was a very nationalistic, inward-looking sort of program. But then there was subsequent kind of efforts to this whole friendshoring process, essentially to extend those benefits elsewhere, including to Australia. So the acceptance grew in that kind of context. But I was always broadly supportive of the IRA, even in the initial state, in the sense that it was the biggest economy with the biggest economy in the world in GDP terms, finally finding a way forward on this climate journey, sort of categorical path forward, it seemed, but not to be, as it turns out, through political change. But I think that there's what you're seeing in Australia now is actually like people, those same industry members who I mentioned who were upset about the IRA are actually thinking about, well, we're going to get that opportunity we didn't have previously. So there is a cost there to the US, I think, and I think that's being seen elsewhere as well. That a lot of other countries are actually thinking that they might be able to cash in from the US application of clean energy leadership. So I think we have that context is relevant in the sense of the Quad, because the US is obviously a key member of the Quad. Having that lack of leadership there anymore is a bit damaging. I think that it's not permanent in some senses. I think there are still areas where there can be coordination between the various members of the Quad, but generally I think things probably will need to start more at a bilateral level. From my perspective, is a lot of potential in the Australia-India relationship in particular. So in some of those areas like solar manufacturing or battery manufacturing, there's a logical kind of complementarity around Australia, starting from the raw material side of things and India's manufacturing ambitions. But generally, again, I think there's a need to meet in the middle somehow, so to share the benefits. So it can't just be that one country is just considered, in Australia's case, to be the quarry for the world in these kind of places, because we are looking to use our economic resources, our economic base, to actually meet the challenge of climate change, but also add value to our economy and add complexity as well. So I think there just needs to be mutual respect for those sorts of opportunities. How you operationalize that is quite difficult, obviously, and that's some of the challenge we're facing at the moment, that everybody wants to be basically the new kind of clean energy superpower, and they want to get as much of the opportunity as possible. But I think what is really critical is that we need to still apply an economically rationalist lens to a lot of this activity at the same time as a security lens. And a lot of times where different states have these advantages, so a comparative advantage in the traditional sort of economic language, there's also a security advantage. So in Australia's case, for example, there's an ambition to move further into minerals processing from just mining, and that happens to be the place where most of the supply chain concentration is at the moment as well. So that's an area of actual recognised economic opportunity and strategic opportunity as well. So I think that we should be focused on exploiting those opportunities as much as possible. So in the Australian context, I think what is quite useful, we have this Future Made in Australia plan, which I know it's similar to everybody's kind of Future Made in India or Made in India plan, or a variety of different platforms or programs that are happening internationally. There is this national interest framework that is basically applied to deciding where government will allocate finite public resources, essentially, because there's abundant opportunity in a lot of different sectors, but it doesn't necessarily make sense, I think, for Australia to be a major manufacturer of solar panels, for example, because it'll just end up adding expense to our energy transition and our ambitions to actually use renewable energy to decarbonize other sectors. So it makes sense for us to actually be importing cheap solar panels or partnering with a country like India on that sort of thing from an energy security perspective. So I think what I would ideally like to see is something like that, this sort of national interest framework that every country who is engaged in this space in partnerships has that, and then we can coordinate as much as possible those national interest frameworks and harmonize them essentially and come to some sort of agreement essentially on what the logical division of labor, division of economic opportunity is, and then operationalize that to the best extent possible. I think that how we do that, again, challenging. There needs to be state support, significant state supporters. I think the other two speakers have touched on a lot. It's a pretty simple equation that governments need to play a more active role in financing, in de-risking projects, not just financially though as well, but also in terms of things like regulatory overhauls to increase accelerate the approvals timeframes for projects, to provide some of the infrastructure that's necessary, the labour force, the R&D, all these sorts of things. At an international level, I think, as I said, again, there needs to be just coordination of those plans. We can't just be focused on the old sort of free trade perspective of market access. We really need to actually be understanding each other's strategic perspectives on these industries and how those things fit together. So yeah, I think in the Quad context, it will have to start at a bilateral level at this point in time, where there is most complementarity. From my perspective, that is Australia-India cooperation on those things like battery manufacturing and solar manufacturing. But there's expansion opportunities there as well, I think, with sort of a Quad plus arrangement with other countries. And if the political winds change in the US and even Japan to some extent, because Japan's sort of energy transition interests aren't particularly well aligned with Australia and a lot of times, or perhaps with India as well. If some of the political winds change in those areas as well, then we can develop a broader Quad process of engagement on these sorts of things.
Right, sir. Now, two things that I want to pick up from your points is that first one is that we have to start bilaterally, right, and then we have to look at better operationalization of it. And the second thing is the nations have to take care of each other's interests, right? So I think a common minimum program would be better, so to make sure that all the partners are on the same page at some of the major points that are a point of contention currently, right? I think that should be the way forward, and the nations should come together. And as Mr. Carafano also said, that one of the major features of Quad is that it is flexible, right? So it can adapt to different realities in different times, at a faster pace than other multilateral forums can do, right? Now, Mr. Carafano, sir, you have consistently emphasized the importance of integrated multi-domain operations for national security, right? In the context of the Indo-Pacific, how do you see the Quad leveraging synergies across maritime, cyber, space, and aerial domains to enhance this maritime domain awareness? And what institutional or technological frameworks, according to you, would best support this effort?
Yeah, so I want to throw a couple of things in the mix. First, I know it sounds like James and I are on completely different planets on energy policy, and that's true. But he said something that we absolutely both agree on, which is the energy strategy has to make sense as an economic strategy, and it has to make sense as a security strategy. And I think we both agree that if that was the policy of all four nations of the Quad, that what we get was a much more pragmatic, realistic path forward. So we definitely agree on that. I also wanted to say on the kind of the framework thing is one of the reasons why I am such a fan of the Quad is what we've wound up with in the Indo-Pacific is almost the opposite of what we wound up in the transatlantic community, where we have a very rigid structure of interaction. There are some things you can only do with the EU. There are some things you can only do with NATO. There are some things you can only do bilaterally. And there's not a lot of options there, and none of them are perfect. But because Europe never really Indo-Pacific never really ossified into an organized structure like that. Instead, what we've got is we have a Quad, we have lots of trilats, we have bilats, we have ASEAN. And I actually think what we have is a much more robust and resilient international system, because you have choices about where you take something to get resolved. And I actually think that's in many ways, the Indo-Pacific allies are in a better position than they are in Europe because they can actually move faster and more flexibly. The Quad Plus format's always something I maintain. The issues you've mentioned are obviously all ones that are in that basket. There are space and issues that can be worked at the Quad level, but also many things are being worked at the bilateral level. Same thing with security, same thing with multi-domain awareness. I actually think these are ground that's getting pretty plowed. Now, what actually isn't being mentioned, if I can back up a bit, is actually stuff that's a lot less sexy, but maybe is really as much as important. So what I would say is fisheries. I mean, the fact that we don't have more proactive international cooperation, countering malicious fishing activity, which is a common problem in many parts of the world and many allies, and why the U.S. isn't really striking bolder leadership on that, because in every theater we go, there's an ally that's really suffering from this, whether it's Argentina or the Philippines or Iceland or the Faroe Islands or so. That's one. The other one, and it goes to actually the question that you asked, John, and it's actually part of the answer to the critical minerals and the energy thing, which is, and in some ways it's low-hanging fruit, is sometimes things are cheap and plentiful and profitable because they're manufactured with slave labor. I mean, and this is not just a China problem. There are huge illicit trafficking in humans, human slavery, sexual exploitation. There's big problems in lots of countries in the region, including the Philippines and Indonesia, obviously in China. Nobody should be exposed to buying these products, and no company that operates them should be free of sanction or criminal pursuit from legal countries. So the one thing that Japan and India and the United States and Australia share in common is, very strong legal tradition, lots of legal assets, lots of international legal cooperation. U.S. and Australia have Five Eyes. The U.S. has strong bilateral security, law enforcement relationships with everybody. I think we've got legats in every country. To me, this is low-hanging fruit. I mean, some of this stuff we can take off the table simply by trying to get products out of the market that are made with illegal labor and get companies that are intentionally in countries that are intentionally allowing exploitation of human labor. It's actually a big focus for the Trump administration. One of the things we've done is completely reorganize the DRL and the State Department. And one of the top tier issues, cross-cutting issues for them, is human trafficking, human slavery, sexual exploitation, and super cooperation emerging between State Department, FBI, Homeland Security in the United States, CIA. That is an area where there's plenty of space for cooperation. It's not as sexy as some of this other stuff, but I things like slave labor and exploitation of fisheries. I know it's not as sexy as going to the moon, but these are things that are impacting people's everyday lives and destroying destroying environments. I think it's definitely something we should put higher up on the screen. So sorry to hijack the question, but there you go.
Right. So now I think those are some of the very important issues, the most pressing ones, which are not coming to the limelight. As we speak of cyberspace, maritime piracy, and other stuff, we forget about fisheries. Of course, half of the maritime issues that WTO deals are in fisheries, right? So I think that's a very important point that you raised, and it's actually the lesser discovered, or let's say explored, part of the cooperation area that the Quad nations have. Now, Dr. Coyne, as a contributor to the Darwin Dialogue on critical minerals and ESG compliance, which specific recommendations such as strategic stockpiling, shared value chains, or downstream refining partnerships do you believe should be prioritized within Quad cooperation to both reduce dependency and meet growing technological demand for the industry?
Thank you for that question. Look, I guess I'm a huge fan. I make it no hidden point. And I'll sort of again riffs off something that James B said, which is so I'm a free marketeer. Okay, I believe in free markets. Number two is that for the audience, I am not a young man, so you know, I was working in national security just as the Berlin Wall came down. So for 30 years, myself and my generation have experienced all of the benefits of globalization, all of them. So, you know, investment-wise, my retirement money, so just-in-time supply chains, centralization of production, just-in-time supply chains. These things were fantastic. I don't think it's the end of globalization, but I do think that if the markets are so distorted, and I use critical minerals as a key example of this, if the markets are so distorted that normal market forces don't bring about the economic security we need, then governments must intervene. Okay, and it goes against being a free marketeer, but this is one of those challenges. Now, one of the biggest challenges in terms of critical minerals and rare earth really comes down to the distortive effects of price volatility, which turn off investors. And that means, you know, from mum and dad investors all the way to institutional investors, if you look at these things, price volatility means, you know, it's hard to see return on investment, both in the short or long term. And there's not a lot of patient capital out there. So I believe that, and to some extent, the Darwin Dialogue's recommendations, and I'll sort of give you a little bit of thing on Darwin Dialogue in a second, about establishing a strategic critical minerals reserve, really was what we actually need in a virtual sense, is a strategic critical mineral reserve to flatten out some of that pricing issues and the pricing volatility. So it's great Australia's doing that, but that won't have the impact that we want. What we need to do is have a small grouping of countries doing that in a virtual sense. Now, whether that's at a bilateral to begin with, so Australia has announced that it is going to have a critical mineral reserve. What we really want, I believe, is to have, as a start point, is to have countries like Japan, India, Australia, the US, developing a critical minerals reserve that allows at times the release. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because every person in industry is happy to have a floor price. The question then becomes, should we have a ceiling price as well? Now, when I speak to the boards of mining companies, be they juniors or be they large corporations, nobody wants a ceiling price. And so that's a difficult decision. But in all of this, I do want to go a couple more things. For the panel itself, I'd raise this issue. First off, that I think we've reached the end of the point of utility of talking about critical minerals. I had a senior fellow of mine write a report on this, and so initially a few years ago, I really thought that if I did a Venn diagram of critical minerals, you know, I bought everyone's critical minerals, I'd find a nice little space here that I could concentrate on. The truth is we're all talking about different things. So if we're talking at a strategic macro policy level, critical minerals is useful. Okay, but I think we've reached to the end of the utility of that discussion. So now what we need to do is break down. So the Quad can't collaborate on all critical minerals, but maybe there's a small subset that we are going to be able to. Maybe we can break down and start and get really granular at individual critical minerals that are of benefit to our 4 nations. I take both James B and C's points on economic security, and this is something I struggle with. I have in my programs, I have a climate and security program, and I use that to climate and security. And so I spent a lot of time considering, and I believe that climate change is an existential threat. But I also see, okay, we can't introduce, so for instance, in systemic national security vulnerabilities by racing to adopt technology for which there's no supply chains outside of China that create security. So that's not to say that we trade off addressing climate change for security, but what I'm saying, we have to find a way, and this will no doubt, please one James and maybe annoy the other James, but we have to find a way that it's economics and security. The third point, something that James C made me think about his matrix model. You know what's really interesting? As a strategic analyst, I began my career many years ago looking at Southeast Asia, and forever and a day, people criticised ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for not being an EU. Okay, and they still do to this day. So you'll find academics and commentators writing, you know, ASEAN doesn't do what the EU does. The fact is ASEAN has achieved what it wanted to achieve for starters. So it's kept peace in the region for the most part since its establishment. Okay, it is slow and bureaucratic, and it is different from the EU. But it never was designed to be like the EU. And so this idea of matrix to me, I think or lattice work, which I think I've started to read more people talk about in this. So I think that's okay. I think that, you know, the Quad is never going to be NATO. That's not the purpose of it. But that doesn't reduce its utility. It means its utility is in a very different space. And so I guess the answer for all of this is critical minerals, rare earths. The Darwin Dialogue, I started for 3 years, or tried to do it 4 years ago, was because I thought the problem of rare earths and critical minerals was too big for one country to address. In the first year, I invited the Japanese and the US. It's a 1.5 track. I invited them because I believe that the US wanted to find an alternative resilient supply chain. The problem was too big for them, too big for Australia, and Japan it was too big for them, and they had a great economic model, which was China and not China or. So they were looking at alternative supply chains. They'd been successful or heading to success with Linus. In the second year, in the first year, I might add, I had India as an observer, and I was very, very pleased to have the Indian High Commissioner come to that. The second year, we included Korea, because they too, 80% of their industry inputs for manufacturing come from China. So I do believe that there's an opportunity, and it's a very long way to get to this, but I do believe there's an opportunity for the Quad to have an impact on this. And it may start at a bilateral level with the US and Australia, or Australia and India, and then grow from there. I think that grouping does give an additional lens that's different than, say, Japan, Korea, US, and Australia. And finally, I think that, you know, we just got to accept that the Quad is what the Quad is, and work within that reality. But I'm sure I've annoyed everyone just a little bit. I've made some people happy a little bit, and hopefully given some food for thought. Thank you very much.
Right, so I think the Critical Minerals Reserve Fund, or rather Critical Reserve, is a very good idea. But on the other hand, as you also mentioned, that the price cap is something that the market despises, right? So I think for that, we need to diversify the supply chains as well, including the partners in Southeast Asia and East Asia, right, who are not from the Quad, right? Because without them, I don't think that processing the minerals would be an easy process for the Quad nations themselves to achieve, right? Without the much needed diversification. Now, Mr. Bhavan, in November of 2024, leading with example, the Prime Ministers of India and Australia agreed to expand cooperation on solar manufacturing, battery and mineral processing, and green hydrogen. What specific structural or regulatory reforms would be essential for Quad partners to operationalize this into a resilient and better integrated clean energy supply chain across the 4 nations that we are?
Thanks. So I'll take my opportunity to respond to some of those points as well, to divert for a second on the energy security side of things as well. So I mean, I just want to bring it back to the topic at hand in that context. So I mean, I want to respond to say that I don't think that I think it's a false dichotomy to say that people choose between, or countries choose between, energy security and energy transition. Basically, any plan that any country makes, or any individual company or individual entity makes, always has energy security at the front of mind So I mean, if you look at the Chinese case, the reason that China is so dominant in a lot of clean energy technologies and clean energy sectors is because of energy security, because they made a conscious choice to not be so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And so they had a massive emphasis on building out renewables and building out electrification and building out EVs. And actually that has actually been one of the main drivers of their action on climate change. And this is my main point, I think, is that we need in a body like the Quad or in our policy more generally to realize that there don't need to be tensions there. Similar story in Europe after the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I mean, I don't know how that was misconstrued as being representative of Europe's folly in climate action, because the vast amount of problems they had were because they had overdependence on Russian fossil fuels. So even in the current context, basically, I don't think that dependence on China for critical minerals will ever replicate the market concentration or the market power that OPEC or any other major oil producer had, in the sense that most of that stems from geological misfortune of the cheapest exploited resources being located in one area. And you have to constantly consume fossil fuels. You can't recycle them the same way you can metals or minerals, etc., or technologies, basically. The volumes are consumed are much smaller, and 40% of the trade, maritime trade, is from fossil fuels. So if we get rid of that, massive maritime security benefit. So I'm kind of advocating more for a hard-nosed security perspective on the energy transition in that context. And, you know, I think that a lot of thinkers in Australia see this as well, because one of the big challenges that we have is dependence on foreign imported oil. It's one of the rationales that's given for AUKUS, for example. So if you actually invested more in energy transition in Australia, lowered your dependence on oil, don't really need so much focus on AUKUS or maritime security in that kind of context. So I just want to make those points. But in the leading back to the kind of critical minerals space, what I see as a relation to that is that basically China's advantage is not insurmountable. It's not purely because of geology, it's because of policy interventions, essentially. So it's about the way that they've leveraged their industrial muscle. It's the way that they have played a very nationalistic, economically nationalistic game. And basically they recognize the opportunity a lot earlier for security reasons. So I think that's what we need to, how we need to treat the issue in Australia or any other countries in the Quad, or generally around the world, and in bodies like the Quad as well, in a cooperative sense as well. So in terms of Australia-India cooperation on these things, I did mention basically that I see a lot of promise. I'm very bullish on the Australia-India relationship in this context, in manufacturing, solar manufacturing, battery manufacturing. Green hydrogen, I think, is a bit more complicated in the sense that it's not going to be a big trade opportunity because it's very difficult and expensive to export, but there'll be opportunities for countries to use green hydrogen or use their renewable energy bounty to produce green hydrogen and then decarbonize things like steel, and then we'll develop a new trade around that. So basically, though, I think, again, the challenge really is about how you scale up essentially from the bilateral level to a multilateral level, or to create a market essentially. And I think that really depends on things like sustained finance and provision of infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily have to come from these two countries, from their governments, from Australia and India. There can be third-party involvement in some of those relationships. I think that, you know, there's a bit of focus on the labour force that's needed for these sectors as well. And I mentioned some things about R&D and basically all the enabling factors. It doesn't necessarily need to be that it is the two countries, Australia and India, are involved in this. We could bring in Japan and the US and Quad Plus sort of arrangements as well. But I think what's really, I think we've touched on this a little bit as well, a lot of what's missing from the supply chain development side of things in clean energy is the demand side picture for scaling up these sectors. So a lot of the manufactured goods that are going to be produced outside China are going to be costlier than alternatives to start with. So the companies who are engaged in this need guaranteed to demand to invest and to lower their borrowing costs. So some sort of government coordinated buying platform will be beneficial in the Quad countries, and maybe Quad Plus arrangements could help there. For raw materials like critical minerals, John, I think, covered this a lot. A lot of the challenge is really about smoothing out the volatility in the markets and reducing all of that manipulation that's taking place. And I think that there needs to be sustained support to companies and countries who are looking to break through and remain viable long enough that they can make a difference in terms of the markets in which they operate. So they actually, some of their market-based preferences actually become the norm rather than the exception at this point in time. And I think that some of those conversations that we did have around price premiums, John mentioned that we've gone nowhere in terms of the conversations or the lobbying of the London Metals Exchange for price premiums, but perhaps there is an ability for more coordinated government action through the Quad or through a variety of different countries and companies, and coordinating their efforts to actually continue that sort of process of trying to get those premiums in place. I think I want to circle back a little bit as well to the question around governance. I promised I'd kind of give a bit of a response to John's early comments on that. So I mean, Australia does, have a lot of history in the resources industry, but our history of governance hasn't been fantastic at home or abroad even. So we look pretty good on paper, but there's not a lot of oversight of resource development in a lot of remote areas of Australia or overseas as well. We haven't put in place some of the best practice things, like we haven't implemented the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which requires a lot of disclosure of public payments, company payments, and a lot of coordination amongst stakeholders. Australia used to have this program called Mining for Development as well, which was a capacity building program that worked with developing countries to try and avoid the resource curse. So I think we can there's a lot of areas to work on, and Australia, from its perspective, could move forward on these, but the Quad could take up these as some of their governing principles or programs as well. In terms of the market-based approach that John was mentioning as well, getting that coordinating power around companies or interest in the Quad to actually work on things like certification regimes for sustainably produced minerals would be great. And there's also a lot that we can do with technology now as well. So the EU is working on this kind of battery passport idea as well, that you can actually log all the sort of ESG criteria that go into making a battery essentially as well, and then it can be disclosed to consumers. So looking at some of those options as well, I think coordination between multiple partners is always better. Making these things standard practice, making these things actually the norm rather than the exception would be fantastic.
Right, sir. Now, as you rightfully mentioned about minimizing the volatility in the market itself, I think the India-Australia agreement should work as a major objective, this minimizing the market volatility. And secondly, I think the industry has a very long gestation period. For that, the industry will have to, lead with example. Only then can they, give out results and say that, look, we have done all of that in such a short period of time, and there's so much opportunity to be explored in this industry, and people should join in. And once that happens, I think then only can the governments, lay the incentives for the industry as well, because we can't have a top-down approach for such capital intensive industries in the short term or in the medium term. Now, Mr. Carafano, as one of the key voices on strategic logistics and naval deterrence, how do you view the Quad's role in safeguarding the uninterrupted flow of critical minerals and its shipments through contested maritime routes, especially in light of rising gray zone threats and choke point vulnerabilities like that in the Malacca?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just like to emphasize a point that John made, which is no nation can solve the critical mineral rare earth challenge alone, and it is going to take a consortium approach to this. And so, and the Quad, this fits very well with U.S. strategy. The U.S. is doing mineral deals in Ukraine, it's doing mineral deals in Africa, and really what it's trying to do is to create a diversified sources for processing and mining, so that you sort of break the back of monopoly of the market. And so facilitating that through the Quad, I think, for the Indo-Pacific region just makes perfect sense. But the point about supply chains is equally, well, President Trump is particularly enamored with the idea of free and open spaces that that Prime Minister Abe first introduced. In many ways, kind of a foundational principle for the development of the Quad. First of all, we're going to see tomorrow a great step forward in that, because Azerbaijan and Armenia are going to initial a peace deal. And part of that peace deal is going to be opening the Severdar corridor. So you can actually have a rail line virtually that is going from Central Asia through Azerbaijan, Armenia to Turkey. That's going to have a large capacity. And that line, that final connector piece, which is only like 40 kilometers, that can be done in almost no time. IMEC is also incredibly important. You're going to double, not for energy, right, but for other things, including maybe minerals and certainly containerized cargo. You're going to double the input through the Middle East, which is going to create, I think, enormous opportunities. And then there's always the potential of the Turkish corridor from Basra to Turkey. I think these things go hand in hand, right? So resilient, redundant supply chains come from both the sourcing of materials, right, and resources, but the ability to freely and consistently move those resources from one place to another. And so I think these corridors are incredibly important. I think there's two parts to that. Japan, India, and the U.S. have a particular interest in the Indo-Pacific part. And then India, Australia have a great part in the Indo-Med piece of that. And so you've got essentially the Indo-Pacific, then you have the Indo-Med, and that connects to the Middle East and then the Mediterranean. So there's plenty of work for the Quad partners in all different kinds of formats to work on the free and open corridors. I think this is going to be a major endeavor that powers are engaged in: U.S., India, Japan, Italy, many others.
Right, sir. I think that those are very important points that you've raised regarding the shared interests of India, Australia, and other Quad partners in different regions. And I think they have to work at better interoperability between their coast guards, let's say Navy, and the exercises that they conduct every year or twice a year, or let's say every 2 years. Those are some of the very important power projection exercises that help in reducing these threats that we spoke of, right? Now, Dr. Coyne, with the US Inflation Reduction Act reshaping global mineral trade dynamics, how do you assess the implications of Australia's mineral exports, and what recalibrations might be needed within the Quad framework to avoid an intra-group competition while fostering collaborative supply security?
In answering this question, I'm reminded of a meeting I had a few years ago with a certain Japanese ambassador, and he made the point that even though Australia and Japan enjoyed the closest of relationships, there will still be times where we are competitors, and so I don't think that. I don't think that is in itself a problem. So the idea of navigating a space where, we're in the Quad, where we're not competitors on certain things, is just simply not possible. But I do think this is where, in terms of critical minerals, and I'll go from the general to then some specific observations. I think that in general, this is why talking about critical minerals becomes less useful. So what we need to be talking about is the specific minerals that we want to talk about that are in common. In the more specifics, where the Quad gets to is that ultimately, and it sort of also picks up a little bit of what James B said before. No, I slightly disagree. The world's two most powerful mining countries are Canada and Australia. Australia's company's global footprint in terms of mining is unrivaled, other than by Canada, and the extent of that, you've got to sort of sometimes sit there on certainly a year-by-year basis to see how that plays out. My point of difference, James B, is that no industry, no sector is right all of the time. But I will say this, is that the Australian mining sector has for generations driven the highest of standards. It hasn't always lived up to those standards, but it has set the standards globally in terms of mining and ESG. Does it need to do more? Absolutely. In Africa, in a series of conversations recently, if you speak to a number of African leaders in various locations, they will tell you they would far prefer mines operated by Australian companies that are making significant contributions to the local communities in terms of education and building up democratic values. And I think that's a powerful alternative to what is being presented by Russian and Chinese mining companies in Central South America and in Africa. But at the same time, James C, in my typical larrikin Australianness, I'll say to you that we would most definitely weather through the Quad, and working with the Indians as well and the Japanese, is we would much rather see the Americans investing in supply chains that originate out of Australia, where they are then say the Democratic Republic of Congo. So where our supply chains are not infected by oceans of corruption, are not involving child labour, do not involve slave labour, comply to the highest of ESG requirements, are transparent, and to be part of that. So I do think there's some really big things we can do at a bilateral level and at the Quad level around specific things. Thank you.
Right, sir. Now, I think that's a very important point that you raised regarding the the Quad framework, adopting let's say a non-intra-group competitive approach to reshaping the global mineral supply chains. Now, Mr. Bhavan, climate adaptation concerns such as ocean health and port integrity were emphasized in Australia-India Institute's regional assessments. In the context of clean energy infrastructure, how can Quad states ensure coastal resilience and decarbonization? How do they go hand in hand within supply chain planning?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think this is something that all countries will need to be conscious of, how to build for the climate change era. I think I have already indicated to some extent there are some advantages of the energy transition, that perhaps we don't need as much critical coastal infrastructure if we're not actually using so many fossil fuels, because, as I said, about 40% of shipping is actually used for oil, gas, and coal, and a lot of the things that will take their place won't be so easily traded. We will have much smaller volumes of critical minerals and technologies. We'll be moving more away from fuels to electrification, and we'll be using more domestic renewable energy and more other domestic resources, essentially. And if we look at even things like green hydrogen, I've mentioned that basically there's a difficulty in, it's expensive to produce and more expensive to transport and more difficult to transport. So it makes sense to actually consume these things domestically and to ship basically the metals or the minerals or the industrial goods that are made with them. So those things will look broadly similar to basically the trade we have currently. So in that kind of context, there are some advantages, but I think we also, I mean, actually, so I should add as well, like that I think that we can accelerate the way we think about the energy transition and the types of energy we have to reinforce those benefits. So in a body like the Quad, for example, or countries that have high capacity and we focus on the provision of infrastructure or development finance. We can look at how the rollout of renewables or dispersed renewables, microgrids with storage, etc., can actually avoid dependence on really large power generating assets or integrated networks that actually sustain some of that infrastructure risk. That's we can incorporate that into the planning and provide that support through programs like infrastructure assistance and development finance assistance, capacity building as well. So Australia is going well ahead with this idea of high renewables based grid and this vision of becoming a renewable superpower to some extent. There's a lot of knowledge and accumulation of capacity through that would be valuable to other states that we can pass on. And I think that similar things would be possible with India, the US and Japan as well, and in a coordinated fashion. Again, as I say, always better if we can do that. But I think there's still obviously need for consideration of how we continue to build big things. And I think this is something that India's well prepared to lead on within the Quad. So India has spearheaded this coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. And there's a bit of knowledge and capacity and financial ability that's tied up with that. And it's something that particularly the Quad, I think, could be working on providing infrastructure support to smaller developing countries and low-lying island states in particular who are on the front line of the climate adaptation challenge. And I think, again, I want to apply this security lens in this context because the Indo-Pacific is actually a region that has more natural disasters than the global average already. And it also has the known factors that raise climate conflict risks. So that's a combination of low socioeconomic development levels and large populations. So I think we need to apply more of a security lens to how we provide infrastructure as well. And that includes soft infrastructure. So the knowledge of how to mitigate some of those conflict risks. So ensuring that vulnerable populations aren't displaced and they can continue to have access to food and to water and to shelter and all those basic human needs to mitigate those risks of displacement and leading to conflict should be a more important part of what the Quad does as well.
Right. So I think it's actually obvious that climate change is not something that can be reversed, but it can only be mitigated, and we can only adapt to it, to its nature, right? And coastal resilience will need sustainable infrastructure development and climate financing as well. Now, Mr. Carafano, given your research on civil-military coordination and organizational reform, what kinds of bureaucratic restructuring within coordinations would be necessary to, support quicker decision-making and operational interoperability in joint maritime missions or, let's say, regional crisis?
Yeah, I think the answer isn't really structure and processes. I think it's just frank and honest conversations between the four powers. Not to go back to James' thing, but we both can't be right. I just think he's wrong. Most of the world's energy is produced by fossil fuels. In 30 years, most of the world's energy is going to be produced by fossil fuels. The demand for AI and data centers low is going to drive the electricity through the roof. And I got to tell you, most of the countries in the global south are not going to sit around and live in energy poverty without electricity because they can't afford and nobody's going to give them the money for green transition. So we have two very different views of the world. We're both not right, but this is a perfect issue for the Quad. But they should sit down and they should have honest conversations about this, find points where they agree. I mean, they don't have to agree on everything, but where it's practical and realistic to agree and move forward. I think this energy thing is absolutely a crucial issue. As crucial as the one point is the maritime one. I mean, this is a region which is connected by water. And 80-90% of the world's trade goes on water. 30 years from now, that's going to be true as well. And most of those boats, I imagine, will be fossil fuel driven as well. Maritime coordination is absolutely totally vital. I don't think it's a structural problem. I think it's the countries have to talk and coordinate. The reason why I was always optimistic about the Quad and what I think the Quad work is in many ways, I think the Quad can be the geostrategic, parallel of Five Eyes. Five Eyes works in the intelligence way, but not because of processing anything else, because you have 5 countries which absolutely have committed themselves to having honest and open transactions. If the Quad can achieve that, despite their differences and everything else, the Quad will place a valuable thing. So I do think we have to focus, and this I think for your young folks as well. Everybody focuses on the wiring diagram and the organization and the process and the titles and the plans and the names. Leadership is about people. And I think particularly young people have to focus on how do I work with other people to reach an understanding of our agreements and differences, and then drive it to things that serve mutual benefits. So I think that we if we're focusing on the infrastructure part of the Quad, I think we're missing the reason why the Quad will succeed. When Five Eyes was started, there was no infrastructure. There were no processes. All those things came later after people had committed themselves to the desire to share. And I think that's what worked for the Quad as well.
Right, so I think that those are very important words that you mentioned regarding the leadership and the popular commitment, or let's say the political will in the partner nations. Now, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today and for contributing to such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Our conversation today, I'm hopeful, will provide a better understanding to all our viewers and listeners as we move forward and realize that with these complexities come ingenious solutions. I'm grateful to our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights and to our audience for their thoughtful engagement. Let's continue these important dialogues as we navigate the changing dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and Quad's role in it. Thank you so much once again and have a great day. A pleasure hosting you today.
Yeah, namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you. Thank you.